Today, we're going to talk, today's focus is about maturing, and when you implemented your data cookbook months or perhaps years ago, you set up your workflows to do certain things, and as time has passed, you may be in a position that you want to change those. Either your governance procedures themselves have formally changed, or you've just learned and find that your current workflows could benefit from a little tweaking. There's some awkwardness perhaps at some points, and so you want to make changes to your workflow. So we're going to talk about two use cases or methods of how to approach this. So formally, our agenda will be to talk about how the workflow actually works and what happens when you create a new workflow. We're going to talk about some supporting features. There's a couple features, the queue and the export-import feature that enable work with workflow migrations. Then we're going to talk about those two use cases. For this webinar, I gave them names. The first one I call it the let things take their course approach, and the second use case is you just force things into your new workflow when it is ready. We'll talk about the pros and cons of those two use cases. We're going to wrap up with tips and thoughts and some summary things. And then at the end, as Jim said, after that, there'll be some time for Q&A with the folks on the call today. And we'll, okay, here's my forward button. All right, so how does it work? So there's these first 2 points I want you to remember. The first one is objects, in our case today, definitions. I didn't say that earlier. We're going to be talking through this example using a definitions workflow. So in our case, definitions or objects remain trapped, I use that word trapped, in the workflow that is in use at the time that particular object or definition was created. So a specification would remain trapped in the specification workflow that was in use at the time that that specification workflow was created. So it's helpful to remember that. The second thing to remember is that workflows never die. You can version them and you can archive them, but they never die. They are always available to you, and the objects that may be trapped in a workflow, new material may not be able to utilize a workflow, but the objects that are trapped in that workflow can continue unimpeded to traverse the workflow itself. So there's, the workflow can stop being available for use, but any material, any objects in that workflow can continue without issue. The last thing to remember is that not all changes to a workflow require a new version or a brand new workflow. The user guide, the admin guide, has an itemized list of what triggers a new version of a workflow and what does not. If you don't want to commit that list to memory, and I don't recommend that you do, there is a safety net in the cookbook that allows you to make changes to a workflow, and if you trigger one of the types of changes that would require a new version of workflow, you are prompted at that point and you are asked, the action you are about to take is going to require a new version of the workflow. Do you want to proceed? And if you don't, you just back away from it, and there's no harm done. Things in a broad sense, things that do not trigger a new workflow, are what I call cosmetic changes, labeling things, relabeling a stage, relabeling a step, renaming the workflow itself. Those do not trigger a new version of a workflow. Swapping out user groups does not trigger a new workflow. In a general sense, what does trigger a new workflow is wanting to add a brand new stage, or add a brand new step, or delete an existing step or stage. So significant changes in the actual process of the workflow are going to be what triggers the need for a new version. Okay, so then to kind of summarize those first 2 points, an unapproved object can remain in an old workflow indefinitely. No harm done. And when people do come back and to take action on it, if it is not approved, it'll be there for them when they choose to act. There's a safety net there. Okay. So with that groundwork laid, let's talk about the 2 ways that you can work with this. The green version is that, the green style is that you can actually you can actually version the workflow itself. The second option is that you create a brand new workflow. Let's take a quick look at what versioning an existing workflow looks like. Let's take a look at, I'm logged in to a enterprise level account. Let's navigate over to workflows. And under definition approval, let's take a look at HR, definition approval for HR, which already has 2 versions. I'm going to click on that workflow and you will see there is a create a new version button right there available to me. I could click on it at this time and start that process, but if I click here, I'll get that trigger, create a new version. So I'm going to back away from that for now. So that's what it looks like when you trigger a new version. If I create on edit here, which is just going to allow me to change the name of this drafting stage, I can do that, make my change, and I was not notified. I can make that change without triggering a new version. Let's go ahead and add a new stage to this. Let's say I do want to version this definition. So I am going to actively create a new version. And I am going to, and there's my prompt at that point as well, but I more actively invoked that by creating the create new version button. I click continue. And the action I'm going to take is to create a new stage. Let's say I want to create a group data steward review here at the end. There. And I'll click create. And I'm just going to quickly redirect that transition action to connect to that new stage. So I'm just moving through the normal steps I would take in creating a new stage in a workflow. So I'm partway done here. I've got that. I need to now do a transition action between group steward review and approve. I'm just going to quickly create some pretty simple actions here just for the sake of the demo to keep things moving along. There's my single transition action. I'll just create a single step. I'm not going to do the definition there. Allow edit. I'll put my all data stewards. All right, I'm just going to put administrators there now. I thought I had an all stewards users group, but okay. And I forgot to click my stage transition action. Okay, pick that up. There we go. All right, update. So now I always like to cross-check my workflow, and that looks good. I'm going to save that. Okay. So I am now at version 3 inactive. I'm going to click activate. It's going to give me a little prompt there. This is just normal workflow creation. So now I've just versioned my definition approval for HR, and I'm at version 3. And I did that through the create a new version button. And from there, you are when you do create a new version, you follow the same steps, the same features that are available to you as if you were creating a workflow from scratch. Okay. So if I'm going to create a brand new workflow, that's my other option. I would simply go over to my workflow area. Let's go here, back to all workflows. I'm going to create a new workflow from scratch. I'm going to skip the description for now. It's a definition. It's going to have one stage where the user can create and approve. And here it is. So we're going to save that. I'm going to do a quick show here. I think everything is, yeah, the requester has everything they need. I'm going to activate. So that's a brand new workflow that's been created. And now if I want to use that workflow, if I want that to become my new workflow, I would list that at the top of this page. So I'd have to move it up here to the top, and that would put it in play. Notice I did not have to change the order of my workflow that I versioned. And truthfully, I would want my conditional, if it's HR workflow is conditioned, so I would want that above my primary simple approval workflow. Okay. So to kind of repeat, you can either create a new version of the workflow or you can create a brand new workflow. The decision of which direction you take is frankly just based on what you feel is going to be easiest to understand and accept in your own local community. So we're going to talk now and through the use cases, through some of the examples, how it looks when you take either of these two approaches. So they both work. There's just some, let me talk about one other pro and con here. If you version the workflow, you can never find or use the previous version or versions ever again. So I created a third version of my human resources workflow. There's no way anybody could ever access version 2 for new definitions ever again. I did have 2 or 3 definitions trapped in that workflow, and they, as I said earlier, they will continue to move through that workflow without issue. And I'll note as well that the participants in that now dead workflow would never know that the workflow they are using has been decommissioned. It's completely transparent. They would not know. I think that's a good thing. And then any new material would hit the new third version of the workflow. So there's quite a lockdown there that you want to be aware of. In the other environment with a new workflow, as you saw, my old workflow that was in play here was definition approval with technical review. That was the old one that was the topmost part of the list. If somebody came in and changed that order, that would change. Yeah, you can swap in and out, and you can activate and return to you. Not activate. You can return to use that old workflow because it's still there. One thing you can do is you can archive that workflow to make it unavailable. So you have a little bit of a choice there. So you've created a new workflow that you want to use. Whatever it was you were using before, oh, okay, and so you can't archive it because I've got 2 objects trapped in it. So if you want to formally retire that without versioning it, you can archive it, which will keep it listed, but will clearly indicate with a red mark that it's archived. But before you can get it to the archive status, you have to approve the objects that are currently trapped in it. Okay. I think I'm not going to go into the use cases, but I think there's reasons why you might not want to archive it. There might be reasons why you want to go back and use that workflow in another time that are genuinely governance related. I would make that decision based on a clear sense of governance direction and have a reason. We are not going to archive our previous workflow because of A, B, and C governance reasons, and we know that in 6 months we will want to return to it. There needs to be a clear reason. If I don't recommend that you do not archive something, you keep it there just in case, or maybe not sure, or just hesitant. If you don't have a clear reason for keeping it there, I would archive it. And if you do then need to go back to it at some point in the future, you just create a brand new workflow at that point in time when your sense of direction has changed. So do you see what I'm saying? I'm saying archive it unless you have a clear reason, clear governance, anticipated reason why in the future you would want to go back to it. And do not keep it live kind of as a maybe we kind of want to use this, not sure. I think that's setting yourself up for some wobbly governance situations. Okay. And hard to communicate. You know, when you're wobbly about the governance, it's hard to communicate, whereas if you just clearly end the workflow, well, then people have it's easier to scale that decision. Okay, and communicate that decision. All right. So let's take a step back and look at some the support features, queues and import, export, or in this case, export, import. So in order to make a decision as to whether you want to version a workflow or create a new one, you would base some of that decision on what's my inventory of what is in my workflows. So if I go to the definition queue, this will be a way to see into my definition population. I have 281 definitions. Well, where are they throughout the course of my workflows? So I use the queue, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this queue feature, except to say that the top filters are working from left to right, and they are dependent on each other. So I'm going to choose my, I know that the bulk of my 281 definitions are in this definition approval workflow. So I'm going to select that. I think there's about 275, yeah, exactly, 275. And then from there I can say, well, oh, and I want to uncheck hide available action for me, because I don't want, I don't want this to be about me. I just want this to know what's in the inventory, not what's available to me to take action on. So how many are in drafting? So out of 275, 336 are in drafting, the very beginning of the stage of the workflow. How many are in review? I think there's about 40, 39. So I would then kind of go through then the rest of my workflows and just kind of get a ballpark range of where is my content sprinkled throughout all of the workflows that are available to this object type. And then that'll help inform the decision that I'm going to make. So just take a look at things through the view of the queue. The other feature to be aware of is import and export. Again, further details of this feature are in your documentation, but you can import definitions through a bulk CSV file. You can export definitions according to a set that you determine through the browse feature. So if I navigate over to definitions, browse definitions, and maybe I've used the tag here. Let's look at workflow demo. Today I've got 3 definitions I think that are tagged here, 2. So I can download that set of definitions. I could also download, if I take that tag off, obviously I could download all of my enrollment definitions as well using functional area. And of course, I could download all 374 through this feature as well. Okay. So now let's go back to the slide deck and talk about some more use cases here. So what if we choose the option to let things take their course? So let's, for each of these two methods, I'm going to describe it and then talk about the steps and then talk about when to use it, pros and cons. All right. So in this use case, so I'm going to let things take their course. So in this scenario, maybe your workflow's been up for a little while and you never put in a standards review. And you're now a year into your workflow and you've got maybe 90 definitions in there. And you're noticing that the data stewards are having a hard time writing good quality definitions and things are getting to the approved state in with mixed quality in their writing and in their just in the quality of the writing. It's inconsistent. So to fix that, you want to put a standards review in the workflow so that somebody takes a look at that and is screening for that and giving those stewards some support before the item is approved. Now, I would argue that that kind of a change is adding an editorial stage that you are not fundamentally changing the trajectory of the governance activity itself. You are not undermining the authority of the data stewards, nor are you adding a governance oversight. The standards stage is there for editorial support, not for governance support. So I would factor that in a couple ways. I meant to put the number of definitions I have here. So I would take into consideration how many definitions are trapped in the current workflow. I would use my definition queue to find that out. And if most of them, sorry, I got some typos here. If most of them are later in the stage, if most of them are already in the technical work stage, I might just let it play out. And by that I mean I would create a new version of my definition approval workflow. And then any new things would be able to take advantage of that standards review. But I wouldn't go back and touch any of the earlier definitions, whether they were approved under that previous workflow or if they were just waiting in that workflow. So to prepare that, I certainly would communicate a little bit. I would communicate with my data stewards that this was happening. I would just communicate with the parties who would be impacted. I would use the queue, as I mentioned, to get a count of how many things are in which stage. And then based on that, I would make my decision. Do I want a new workflow or do I want to version the existing one? And I had said earlier I would version the definition. It doesn't matter which one you choose, except for the consequences that I had described earlier. You know, there's no, based on this use case, I don't personally have a preference as to whether I do new workflow or version the existing. And then as a reminder, if I version it, then I guarantee that there's a lockdown, no more use of the previous workflow. Not so critical in this case, it's just an editorial change. If it's a new workflow, I could return to the prior workflow by reordering it. So those are what I would think about, and then in my prep, and then to execute it, you would create and test either the new version or the new workflow, and then I already demoed how to trigger a new version. Let me talk through the next use case, and then I'm going to go back to the cookbook and show you more of how whether you choose to version or create new, how that looks a little differently in the material itself, in the definitions over in the glossary side. Okay, and if I had chosen to build a new workflow, I would have just created the new workflow, activated it, and tested it. All right, let's talk about a different use case, which I call force it. And I call it this, it's the situation where you have made a significant change in the trajectory of your governance. And you need every single definition to follow this new workflow. Whether you have been approved or not, you need to move through this workflow and be approved by this new workflow. So the use case would go something like this. Starting at whatever arbitrary date, in this case March 1st, the new rule is that there must be a technical definition for every glossary entry. That the cookbook will become the technical repository for at least one data system. And prior to that, the technical definition was optional. Definitions may or may not have had one. So in my current workflow, there's a drafting stage, a data steward review, and then it goes to approve. And then in the new workflow, I need to add a new stage for technical review. So in this case, I'm adding a new stage. I added a new stage before when I added that standards review. Same action in terms of what I added to the workflow. Big difference, though, from the governance perspective. This is a governance decision to rework that workflow versus an editorial decision to rework that workflow. And of course, I have this goal now that all of my objects, my definitions, must use the new workflow. Everything has to be touched. So this is a much heavier lift. So my prep, much bigger communication plan. This is a significant policy change. In order to get definitions, the currently approved definitions, to take advantage of the new workflow, you're going to have to do an export, deletion, and re-import. And that's going to wipe out any history on those previous definitions. So if you had a definition that had 3 versions, you would be deleting that definition and re-importing whatever was the most recently approved version. You would be re-importing that into your data cookbook, and it would show up in the new workflow as version 1. And no one would ever know that it had 2 previous versions. So there's some loss there of governance history. Obviously, you want more opinions on that because you see the trade-off there. You're trading off, I'm losing some governance history by having to export and re-import my definitions in order to hit the new mandatory workflow. And there's a loss of some governance activity to do that. May or may not be okay. I don't know. It just depends on your situation. You want to explore it and ask the questions and talk to people. And then because, again, this is impacting so much of your content, you want to schedule the actual work during off-peak times. All right. So the steps in this one are build and test either your new workflow or your new version. Doesn't matter which of those choices you make. Then you export all of your definitions. You have to manually delete them, and you have to manually unattach them from any specifications that they are linked to. So that third step there is can be pretty manually, a lot of manual labor there. Fourth step is position the new workflow. Fifth is re-import all your definitions. They will hit the new workflow and they will all come in as drafting. And then you would have to manually reattach, make those relationships again between those definitions and any specifications that they were attached to. So a fair amount, could be potentially a fair amount of manual unlinking and relinking in relationship to your specs. So knowing that that's the workload, that may cause you to re-evaluate your earlier first decision, which was the crux of this use case, which was that all definitions must be reflective of the new workflow. Now that you see what the work that could entail in that, that might influence that decision. Okay, so if I'm just going to let things take their course, I would use that when I'm really just tweaking. I'm not changing the governance substantially, and I don't have a lot of things trapped. And so for them to kind of just gradually make their way through the process that they were born into is fine. Drawbacks are that things may just take a long time to get through their original process that they were trapped in. The other drawback is that there will be two workflows in play at the same time. Some of the definitions will be reflecting of the previous one, and some will be reflecting of the new one. And that may be confusing or not. In the Force-It one, where you are exporting your definitions and re-importing to hit the new workflow, you use it. Of course, it's a substantial governance change, significant, and when you feel all objects must reflect this. Drawbacks are it's a lot of work, and when I say a fake version there, it creates a loss of governance. It's a fake version because definition now reads as version 1, when in fact it's really been versioned previously, and you don't know that anymore. So again, just to reiterate, whether you let things take their course gradually or force it, no right or wrong answer. You make that decision just based on what the governance goals are and what your community can understand and interpret. So before I go into tips and thoughts, let's go back and look at a couple things here. If I go I'm back into my demo account, I'm going over to definitions, I'm at Browse Definitions. Let's take a look at some of those HR definitions. So I've got, as you know now, 3 versions of an HR workflow. Actually, let me select recently created in the HR area. I created 2 earlier today, adoptive child and dependent child. So if I click on that and I open up that workflow, there I have my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stages there. I know because I set this up that this is using workflow version number 3, but it's transparent over here. You can't tell at this point that that this workflow is dead and that there is a version after it and a version before it. It's number 2. You can't tell that. All right, if I go look at, so kind of just visually remember what that workflow looks like. If I go back and look at job title, which was created in the previous version 1 of that workflow, you can see it's a different workflow. Oh, sorry, that's not a good answer. That's not using the HR. Let's go back to let's take away recently. Let's take a look at student employee, which is an older. Oh, that must have been created. I apologize. Those are also using, those were created before even version 1 of HR was created. Let's create a quick new definition, which I know is going to trigger version 3. So here's my definition. I'm going to select the HR. So there's definition approval for HR. I'm going to save. So that's going to hit version 3, and you can see that the stages are different there. But the name of the workflow is the same. You can change that if you use unique labeling in your workflow versions. You can correct that to give people a little bit of a heads up. Pros and cons to that. See, it all depends on if people look at this and the workflow title has changed. Is that going to be perceived as some easier to understand or harder to understand? If what you're trying to communicate is that this is the HR workflow, you're in the right place, then the fact that there's multiple versions of it is irrelevant. So again, you can see which workflow is in play but you cannot see what version is in play. You would have to know and come over here, look at the workflow more carefully to figure out what version it was. In the queue, let me just look at the queue for a minute here before we go. You may have seen earlier when I clicked on the drop-down box there of navigating over from left to right, you saw the different versions. So I'm in definition approval here. There is all my HRs, 1, 2, and 3. So if I go to HR version 2, and there might be nothing there. Okay, so there's 2. Here's the 2 that I created this morning under version 2. And here's the 1 that I created just now under version 3. And of course, I have a bunch. Actually, I don't know if I have any under version 1. So what you want to ask your community is, the way this is displayed, is that clearer to understand than if the names of the versions themselves were different? I think it's actually clearer to see that I've got version 1, 2, and 3 if I know what those numbers mean. So it's really 6 one, half a dozen the other as to what you think is going to be clearer to interpret by the people in your organization. Okay. So having said that, let's look at the tips and thoughts. Shop and discuss and socialize your decision. Don't make it alone. Test it and test, of course, to see what it looks like. Shop that and socialize that. What does it look like? Which one do you think is clearer? Which one is more understandable? Try it a couple different ways. Your method of choice, as I've said already, is ultimately subjective. Fourth one is just do it. You can. I know sometimes that language of changing workflow, it can sound very formal. The language can get, you can feel that you're making really some serious decisions, but you're in charge, and just do it. If you want to experiment, we actually didn't talk about it as an example here, but as an experiment, in an example use case is a lot of clients neglect to build an administrative override, a series of steps in every stage that allow someone in the administrator's user group to take action in that step, in that stage. That can be handy for troubleshooting or demoing. If you're an administrator and you want to demo how a workflow works, if you don't have a courtesy step in each stage, there are some parts of workflow where you can't progress the item to the next stage because you're not a participant in that workflow. So if you want to practice with versioning or making new workflows, that's an interesting use case to work on, is to just create a version of workflow that gives that step to the admins. Oh, another way to see the versioning, let's go back here to my HR examples here. Another way to see the workflow that is in play, let's go to recently created, so I can bring up those new HR definitions. So this was created in the HR definition version 2. I go down here to the bottom. No, it's not approved yet. And I may be trapped. Let me, I don't know, maybe I can. So that just went through it's going through now version 2 of the HR workflow. So you can see it works, even though technically it's dead. But the definition, it's dead to new material. That's how I should describe that. All right. Wait a minute. Browse definitions. Oh, I know what okay. Sorry, that's a mistake there. So what I don't have an example of is if, let's go to an HR definition that is approved. So appointment was approved over a year ago under a previous workflow. It was actually before the HR workflow was even in play there. And if I go to a new version, which is now going to trigger my new workflow. Okay, fine, submit, and that's going to take us through all this. All right, my point, I don't have to take that to approve to show you my point here. My point here at the bottom is that I'm now on version 2. Version 1, if I click on the 1, that will take me back to that first version, and if I click on show workflow there, I can see the workflow that was used to approve it. So my point is that that connection between the workflow that was in play when this object was approved always stays linked or attached, I think the better word, to the object that it acted on. So you never lose that history, which for governance integrity is very important. You always have a record of what was the process that brought that object to approval at that point in time. You have a record, of course, of who took those actions, but you also have a record of the workflow that was used. And that is an important point, even if that workflow is no longer available for new material. And you can see that by clicking on the version number at the bottom of the definition. Okay, sorry for that kind of roundabout way to get to that example. Oh, and I showed this, the change in workflow list in the queue when you saw that HR 1, 2, and 3. That was when I showed that. So in summary, your first part of your process is to decide, and you want to do that in community. You want to do that in conversation. And to inform that decision, you want to inventory where are my objects sprinkled throughout my stages in my current workflow. Then you want to make a pretty detailed plan, and you want to practice with that a little bit in your test environment, prepare the newer versioned workflow, prepare any objects if you need to export and re-import, and then take the action and then communicate. Skills, in addition to the ability to work with workflow, number 2, is number 1, can you navigate through the queue feature? And then number 3, are you comfortable with import and export if needed?